Hello again, it's Dr. Robert Guthrie. I'm back with a continuation of our Sunday school lessons as we're doing a detailed study of the Old Testament. And we're doing today a very important part of the Old Testament that almost I've never heard it mentioned in church or classes or unless I was actually running the class. And this is the Deuteronomic Reform. The Deuteronomic Reform is kind of the last big battle in the 700-year war with the Baals, with the fertility gods. And it wasn't completely successful, but it really accomplished its purpose. Its purpose was to weed out the corruption of the fertility cults, Baal and Ashtart, and all the other worship things that had gotten corrupted, and get the Hebrew, Jewish, whatever you want to call it, community in a line with the more traditional views of the Lord and their relationship with the Lord, so that when the Babylonian exile comes up in about 10 to 20 years, there were two different exiles, a bunch of them will go out to Babylon and become a religious community in Babylon. And that experience will purge the fertility cults. And when they come back in 539, when Cyrus lets them come back, then they come back as a religious community. This sets the stage for Jesus coming in about 500 years later, and he has to deal with a religious community. Of course, it can get, like any community, it can take itself way too seriously and get beyond what it needs to be. But this is a part of God's plan to set these stages. God is beyond time, and so he can set these stages to produce the result that allowed for the Messiah to come several centuries later. So it's a very important aspect of Hebrew history that gets almost no recognition at all. If you're not doing a scholarly Bible class like this one is, you'll never hear about it. So it's an important thing. The Deuteronomic Reform was actually a little bit different than many major reform movements, and that it was a conservative reform movement. People think that every reform movement is what you want to call progressive or liberal or forward-thinking. Not always. This one was trying to restore the previous faith that they had when they came out of the desert before they settled in the Holy Land, to a nation of religious laws, to a nation of leadership by the religious powers, the Levites and the priesthood, and to get rid of all the corruption of the fertility cults. So it's a conservative movement. I know people are shocked at this, but some historians think the American Revolution was actually a conservative revolution, not a radical one. French Revolution was radical. The Russian Revolution in 1917-1918 was radical. China's Civil War, Mao, and all that was radical. American Revolution, in some eyes, it's just an example that you can have conservative reforms, was trying to restore the basic, the allowing the colonies to manage their own affairs. Up until the French and Indian War, the colonies have been pretty much on their own, excuse me, to govern themselves locally, do their own taxes, raise their own defense. And the British were taking that away after the French and Indian War, and so a lot of the thing behind our revolution was actually a conservative one. So it became very progressive once again in the Constitutional Convention and stuff. But so you could have significant conservative reform movements, which is what this one was. And this is the second great reform movement. Remember, a couple lessons ago we talked about Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the first one to try to purge the pagan influences that had gotten inside the temple. They had been putting pagan idols in the temple since the time of King Solomon. And he does this in his own reform, throws them out, and tries to clean it all out, and is somewhat successful. But his son, Manasseh, falls back completely and even becomes more enthusiastic on it. Not only had put the idols back in the temple, he introduced what are called the astral cults, the worship of the sun god and the moon god and the season and all that stuff, which are part of Babylonian culture from farther east. He even did child sacrifice of his own child. He had the necromancers, the spirit fortune tellers come back, etc. So, when he dies, there's a movement that eventually results in replacing him with his son Josiah, who is 8 at the time. It's not clear from the account who ran the country during the 12 years until Josiah becomes about 20 in 629 BC, and he begins his own reform. Now this comes in, and I call him good King Josiah. He really, really, really made the best effort to clean out the paganism, to get rid of the Baals, etc. And he tried, and he did have success. Not complete, because very rare, complete success is very rare. But did have success and was sincere in this. So he starts his own reform about 629, which is more of a nationalistic reform. He could tell by that time that the Babylonian Empire was on its last legs. It had lost, that the Assyrian Empire, I'm sorry, my mistake, that the Assyrian Empire, which is in northwest Iraq, and a capital was Nineveh, almost up to the Turkish border, and they had ruled the whole Middle East, including Egypt and Babylon way down in southeastern Iraq, the whole area through there. They had ruled it for a long time. And they, of course, like any empire, overreached, and they start to crumble. They're being attacked from the north by these warrior tribes. The Egyptians throw them out. The Babylonians throw them out and become independent and attack them as a rival. They're beset from all sides. So this is a good time to try to clear yourself of the Babylonian influences. So he starts a nationalistic reform to really take control of the kingdom of Judah. Now this is a small mountain kingdom. If you've been to Jerusalem, it's somewhat high for the Middle East. It's relatively dry. It's easy to fortify. It has its own spring there. It's got its limestone so you can fortify the walls. It's easy to take a hands-off approach and say, okay, we're going to lie low here, like Switzerland is in a modern circumstance. We're going to be neutral. We're going to stay out of these things, and we're going to hide behind our walls, which is a good thing. But anyway, Josiah decides to reassert their own cultural independence, and he starts getting rid of the foreign influence as best he can. Then in 621, this remarkable thing happens, and he authorizes the priest to do a renovation of the temple on the Temple Mount. This is Solomon's temple, and because you need to take care of your buildings, and so in the process of doing, they find what they call a book. It's probably just a lengthy scroll. They didn't have books in those days. Books come along a little bit before the time of Christ, and this is probably a lengthy scroll. And they find this remarkable discovery. They call it the Book of the Torah. Now, Torah, T-O-R-A-H, is translated in our Bibles as law. It really doesn't mean law. It should be teachings. So these are the teachings of the Lord. Now, it purports to be when they read this to Josiah, and he tears his clothes in agony and vows a total reform, they read him this. It's unclear exactly what it was. Most people think that parts of Deuteronomy were written and hid in the wall. Sounds like a plant to me. And who would have done this? Well, if you read what we discussed about which is like from 12 to chapter 12 to chapter 26 in Deuteronomy, you'll find these very extensive laws about how you conduct yourself as an agricultural community to maintain your religious integrity, what you deal with murder, how you deal with stealing, what you do with this, and how you can worship and all that. So it probably was much of that. And it purports to be a speech, an oration by Moses prior to his death, before he sends them into the Holy Land. And it's a call to remember the faith of the Sinai. But actually it's interesting because it uses the term Horeb for the Holy Mountain, H-O-R-E-B, of the Holy Mountain, which is the term that the northern kingdom used for the Holy Mountain in Elijah's time, rather than Sinai, which is the term for the mountain, the name of the mountain that was used in the southern kingdom. So it appears to have gotten some of its generation from people from the northern kingdom, probably refugees, probably priests who fled down to Jerusalem when the northern kingdom was under attack or conquered in 721. So a lot of it appears to have roots back in the northern kingdom. So my impression, this is an impression, this is not a fact, nobody really knows where this came from. My impression was that there was a faithful religious minority in Jerusalem area who were probably of the Levite tribes. They were the hereditary descendants of Aaron, and they were the hereditary priests and teachers of the law. And they had probably developed this over some length of time and decided to hide it in a place where they could find it. So they could, while this nationalistic reform was going on, they could attempt to impose a religious reform also to get back to the original teachings of Moses and the covenant in Sinai. You remember we talked a couple weeks ago that the southern kingdom had back in Isaiah's time, had been much more obsessed with a covenant relationship between God and the promise of maintaining the descendants of David on the throne of the kingdom, and had not been concerned with the Mosaic covenant as from Sinai, as had the prophets of the northern kingdom, like Elijah. So it appears to be an effort to to restore that. My cat is trying to partake of my 7-Up here. You're welcome to come, cat. That's no problem. So it's an effort to get back to the original Mosaic covenant, and so therefore it's a conservative reform movement. So these are really the teachings, and if you read it in great detail, you'll see that it's, what do you do with this? What do you do with this? What do you do with this? So it has a legalistic tone to it, but it's more of teachings and education about it. So Josiah hears this, and he tears his clothes in anguish, and he doesn't say that he puts on sackcloth or ashes, but he really goes to work on a religious reform, and he really does it, and he means it. So he has them go through the temple, take out everything that's pagan, not only take it out of the temple, but destroy it. If it's wooden, they burn it. If it's metal, they melt it down. There were things up on the roof of the temple for the sun god and moon god and all this other stuff. He gets rid of that. He captures all the priests of the Baal cults and kills them. Vengeance was pretty severe in those days, and kills them. He goes to the high places, which were the old traditional fertility cult sites up on the hills, where they would dance around this sacred pole, kind of like a maypole, and have their Baal rituals at Ashtar there. And he cuts down the poles and chops them up and burns them all. Then he gets bones of the priests that he had killed, executed, and burns them, and takes those ashes and scatters it on the high places, really to defile them, to make them contaminated and unfit for humans to go on there. He gets rid of the sacred prostitutes. There were both female and male sacred prostitutes. He again bans the necromancers, the spiritualists who call up the spirit of the dead. Those had been banned by King Saul way back in the Confederacy, but they'd come back. He absolutely bans human sacrifice, which has never been acceptable in the Yahweh faith, but had been part of the fertility cults for a long time. He goes through all this, and he empowers the priests to clean up the ceremonies, and he has great enthusiasm for this and participates it very aggressively. And they do make the point in the lessons that their success is not due to their own accomplishments, but it's due to God's perseverance and protection for them, that they need to recognize this and be loyal to God and not corrupt themselves with the fertility gods, that they need to recognize that this is God's dominion and be loyal and faithful, which they had not been. And if you think about it, in many cultures, there's a lot of religious hypocrisy. People say they're good, but they really worship money or power or ego or other things like that. And so it's very, very interesting. Again, reports the history of the Exodus, and it even repeats the Ten Commandments, a little bit ordered different in Deuteronomy 5, the first 15 verses of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, and they give the Ten Commandments. And then they go on to all these admonitions against their faithlessness. And you get to the 10th chapter, you come to the great commandment. When they ask Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? He says, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. And then that's the great commandment. He added the second great commandment, which is from Leviticus, and your neighbor as yourself. That's in the Old Testament, but it's not in the Deuteronomy here. So that's the nature of the Deuteronomic Reform. So he really goes after cleaning this up. He again, like I said, bans the pagan idols, gets rid of the priests, et cetera, and really does this. There's one little line in there which I find intriguing, that he banned the household gods. And if you weren't a student of archaeology, as I am, not an archaeologist, but a student of it, you'll realize that there's been reports in the Biblical Archaeology magazine about the Israelis find these household gods in the Israelite housing up until the time of the Babylonian exile. A couple of weeks ago, I showed you some Egyptian artifacts which are probably similar to what are found in these Israelite houses before the exile. And they make the point, when they come back from the exile, the houses are restored, and there's this gap of about 40, 50 years, which you can find archaeologically. You don't see them anymore. So this reform sets the stage to win the war with the Baals, to win the war with the fertility cults, and clean out all this corruption from the fertility cults. So, and it shows the fact that you had these household gods in almost all the houses, shows how pervasive this corruption was. It was just part of everyday life, that they had these things. It was just routine, et cetera, even though it was a corruption, even though it was a defilement of the commandment, no other gods before me, no graven images. They just went on with it anyway. So it's very interesting that this becomes the culmination of the war with the Baals. Then he affects this clean-out, and then he makes a mistake. He gets too full of himself, which is easy for any of us to do, particularly academic doctors like myself. During this time, the dynamics of the Middle East are changing. In 612 BC, Nineveh falls, the capital of Assyria, and the Assyrian Empire is kapoosh, gone. And the Babylonians take over and conquer the northern part of the Assyrian Empire and take it out and begin to impose themselves as the new emperors. A few years later, about 610, the Egyptians who want to restore their own colonial control over the Middle East. Remember, if you go back through Egyptian history, they would always try to capture the Palestine-Canaan area up to Megiddo and all that, and rule it as a colony. They regarded that as their buffer state with the rest of the Middle East. And so they were constantly trying to do that. They come north to Megiddo, which is Armageddon. It's up in north of the Galilee, in northern Israel now. And Josiah comes out to fight him. And it's an incredible mistake. He should have done the Switzerland approach, hidden behind the walls in his small fortress, obscure little kingdom up in the Palestinian highlands, which is now the West Bank, and hidden himself there and stayed behind his walls and ducked and laid low like Hezekiah had. But he goes out to fight him, and they get soundly defeated, and he gets killed. This is in about 610 BC. So suddenly, Judah becomes a vassal state of the Egyptians. They appoint a new king. They remove that king in a few months and appoint another king. And basically, they're back in the same old rut of being captives of the great empires around them. So he failed in the ultimate. But did this reform succeed? Absolutely. This reform succeeded because it prepared the people to become a religious community rather than just a political community or an economic community, to a religious community of the pure faith, to get rid of the pagan corruptions, which the northern kingdom never got rid of, and therefore when it went into exile, it just disappeared into the population of the pagans. When the southern kingdom goes into exile in about 20 years, it goes in as a significant chunk of it, probably led by the Levites and the priesthood and the teachers of the law. It goes there as a religious community, so it bands together in exile. And when Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon, and it's about 539, so it's about 40 to 50 years after the two exiles. There were two things where they took them off to exile, that he allows them to go back. They go back as a religious community. So you don't find the household gods in the houses anymore. You find this strict adherence to the Jewish law, and it really does set the stage to purify that. So in a long-term perspective, it worked extremely well. Short-term, no, it didn't. He didn't win his independence in the battlefield, but that never was the issue. What he needed to do is what he did. He cleaned out the paganism. He won the final victory over the fertility cults, the 700 years with the Baals. This is why I call him good King Josiah, because he really did tremendous service that allowed the faith to continue, to mature, to maintain a monotheistic faith, setting the stage 500, 600 years later for Jesus to come and to take the monotheistic faith, which emerges during the exile in the latter part of Isaiah, which we'll do in a couple of weeks. The clear monotheistic faith that there's only one God, not just our God, but our God is for everybody, allows that to become a worldwide religion like it is now by Jesus coming as the Messiah. So it's a very, very important part of time that most people know nothing about. This is the Deuteronomic Reform, and much of the Deuteronomy comes out of this episode. So we're going to stop here. Hopefully I was able to explain it in a way that made sense. The reading for next week is Habakkuk, which is a very nice 3-chapter minor prophet from this era. And he has an emerging new concept too, which is you should believe in faith, you should have faith for the sake of having faith, rather than just because it's going to get you something from God. And then the first 15 chapters of Jeremiah, 1 through 15. Jeremiah becomes the dominant prophet of this era up until from the time of Josiah through the Babylonian exiles, and he's the prophet trying to tell them to keep their act together, maintain their faith, etc. The Lord will provide. This is Dr. Guthrie. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.